Um, I'm lecturing about Section 3, the politics of the 1920s. Your second quiz uh, will be about uh, this lecture. This course is the United States from the Great Depression and World War II, but I have to give uh, background information leading up to the Great Depression, which started in about 1929. The 1920s was a time of peace and prosperity for the United States. The United States emerged from World War I as a very strong country that had helped turn the tide and win the war. The president at the time during World War I, Woodrow Wilson, however, decided not to seek re-election in 1920, and there was an election that year, and the Republicans nominated Ohio Senator Warren Harding, and his vice presidential candidate was Calvin Coolidge. The Republicans won a landslide victory in 1920. So, Warren Harding has been elected president of the United States. Calvin Coolidge is the vice president. The Republicans control both the House and the Senate. They are clearly the majority party in the United States during the 1920s. The parties at the time, quite different than they were today. Principally, the Republican Party really didn't exist in the South. Ever since the Civil War in the 1860s, the Democratic Party had been dominant. And in places such as Mississippi and Alabama, there were virtually no Republicans at all. Certainly no white Republicans. The Republicans in the 1920s were concentrated in the Northeast, New England, the Midwest, the Plain States, and also the West, like California. The Democrats were again dominated the South. There were plenty of Democrats elsewhere. In terms of ideology, the Republican Party was a somewhat conservative party. The Democrats were a bit more liberal, but that ideological split that exists today will really grow during the 1930s with the advent of the New Deal. Again, the man elected president in 1920 is Warren Harding, a senator from Ohio. His presidency does not last long. However, he's inaugurated in March of 1921. He dies in September of 1923. Historians rank him as actually one of the worst presidents the country has ever had, not because of the economy. The economy was doing great, but because there were a number of scandals during his presidency. Anyway, he dies in 1923, and he's succeeded by a man, Calvin Coolidge, who had been governor of Massachusetts. He will be president from 1923 to 1929. He runs for election in 1924, wins overwhelmingly. Again, the Republicans are just dominant during the 1920s. The economy, again, is doing very strong. But in 1928, Coolidge decides he won't run, and there's a presidential election. The Democrats nominate Al Smith, of New York. Republicans, Herbert Hoover, who was Secretary of Commerce. And again, the Republicans win. This is the third straight election they've won, and it's another landslide. Now, you're going to be writing a paper on Herbert Hoover, so you'll be able to use material from this lecture for that paper, the guidelines of which are already on Moodle. Herbert Hoover was born in Iowa to a Quaker family. He was orphaned at a very early age. His mother and father passed away. He attended Stanford University and became an engineer. And he became a very successful engineer. He made millions in mining in places such as Australia. When World War I broke out in 1914, Hoover was in Europe. And all of a sudden, there were millions of people who were displaced, who needed to be fed. And he wrote, I did not realize it at the moment, but on August 3rd, 1914, when World War I began, my engineering career was over forever. I was on the slippery road of public life. He set up a commission to feed people of Belgium, a small, independent, neutral country that was invaded by Germany. And he helped the population from starving. And he would then, during the war, between 1914 and 17 in Europe, work with the belligerent nations to help ensure that the civilians didn't starve, and he would set up other charitable institutions, and his nickname became the Great Humanitarian. When the United States entered in World War I, President Woodrow Wilson asked him to become the director of the United States Food Administration. And Hoover did that. And he asked people, so for example, to give up beef on Mondays, or and other days give up something, so that the food would go to the troops overseas and also to the peoples of Europe. And it was enormously successful. And everything Hoover does, I mean, he's a success in, be it engineering, food relief, director of the Food Administration. He's enormously popular in the United States and around the world. And after the war, when Europe is struggling to rebuild, he sets up an American Relief Administration. The committee fed over 300 million people in 20 countries. Now, World War I, that turned out to be quite unpopular. Both people in the United States and Europe, once the war was over, were not pleased with the post-war, what had happened. And one man, John Maynard Keynes, said that Hoover was the only man who emerged from the ordeal of Paris with an enhanced reputation. And both parties in 1920 wanted him to run for president. He would have won if he had run in 1920, but he decided not to. Instead, he announces that he is a Republican, and President Warren Harding appoints him Commerce Secretary, which he serves from 1921 to 1928. And to this day, the Commerce Building bears his name. During that time, he did a lot of things. There was a flood in Mississippi, along the Mississippi River in 1927, and he provided relief for people. And when Coolidge announces that he will not run in 1928, the Republicans nominate Herbert Hoover, just naturally. And says something that will turn out to be rather ironic later on. Unemployment in the sense of distress is widely disappearing. We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of the land. The poorhouse is vanishing from among us. Now, that was true. America in the 1920s was the richest country in the world. Um, there was broad prosperity among almost all classes. There were enormous technological advances during the 1920s. Cars, automobiles. Now, these had been, the car had been invented, but people were now buying the car. There were radio, washing machines. Um, Homes were now equipped with electricity, indoor plumbing, running water. People were going to movies, baseball games. You could travel in the car. Even the airplane had been around for a generation. There was farmers were producing record amounts, and America was just economically stronger than any other country in the world. And the good times have been around for almost a decade. And when Hoover says the poorhouse is almost disappearing and unemployment has gone away, that was pretty much true. And there was no reason to think it wouldn't last. So Hoover is elected in 1928 by an enormous, wins an enormous victory and landslide. And he says in his inaugural address, and back then presidents were inaugurated in March, if we survey the situation of our nation both at home and abroad, we find many satisfactions. We find some causes for concern. We have emerged from the losses of the Great War, which is what World War I was known as back then, and the Reconstruction following it with increased virility and strength. From this strength, we have contributed to the recovery and progress of the world. What America has done is given renewed hope and courage to all who have faith in government by the people. In the large view, we have reached a higher degree of comfort and security than ever existed before in the history of the world. That's true. Americans have a higher standard of living than any other people ever in the history of the world. And they have, again, Americans just have consumer goods that the rest of the world, people just can't afford, don't have. And we were saying we should be optimistic. He goes on to say, from this strength, we have contributed to the recovery and progress of the world. And he's right. Now, in 1929, when he becomes president, everything looks great. Beginning in the fall of 1929, change, and that will be the subject of the next lecture. So this lecture will cover the quiz 2, but you can also you will also use this lecture for your paper on Herbert Hoover, and thus concludes this lecture.